Welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show. I think we've probably all seen videos online for years of the Protestant known as Cliffe. I think you pronounce his name Knechtle, his last name there. We've all seen videos of Cliffe talking about everything from baptism to salvation to arguments against atheism. He'll go out there on the streets and preach to people and interact directly with them and then post that on um, post the videos on YouTube. So I think he's pretty well known. He has a son known as Stuart, and it looks like Stuart was just recently, along with his father Cliff, at Harvard. I think is where they're at. Or at least they're interacting with a Harvard student. So not exactly sure. Maybe they're at Harvard, but they have a debate with a Orthodox deacon. Now, here, this is an Oriental Orthodox deacon from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. That's different than the Eastern Orthodox churches. They're currently not in communion with each other. There was a break after the Council of Chalcedon, and I covered that in a previous video. Chalcedon was the year 451, and we saw a pretty massive rupture in the church at that point. And so you have a break with the Oriental Orthodox and then with the Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, who later on had their own division after that. So the Ethiopian Orthodox are part of the Oriental Orthodox. Again, they did not accept the Fourth Ecumenical Council, but they accepted the first three ecumenical councils. And so there is a debate or discussion here between Cliffe's son, Stuart, and this Orthodox deacon, and they're discussing the question of the Eucharist, and maybe a little bit of baptism, but mostly the Eucharist, from the question of, who has the proper interpretation. And the Oriental Orthodox deacon is bringing up the situation with the patristic period, the church fathers, and their view on the real presence. And so they get into a very lively debate. It's about 13 minutes long. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to break it down into three segments of a little bit over 4 minutes each. So I'm going to play a part one, part two, part three, about 4 minutes each. I'm going to play through the whole entire third, play through the part about 4 minutes. Then I'm going to stop and then interact with the material. Then play part two, play the whole thing so you see the whole thing, stop, interact with it, and then do the same for part three. That way I'm not just jumping in and interacting like every 2 minutes or 1 minute and just kind of breaking it up too much. That way you kind of get to see what the video is like, and then we'll go through it and interact with it in detail. Now, let me say at the outset, first of all, the Oriental Orthodox deacon knows more than both Stuart and Cliffe on this subject. So he dominated the discussion, and congrats to him for being able to do so. Now, I think that we often see in these discussions, whether you're Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, anytime a Protestant, there's rare exceptions, but most times when a Protestant encounters one of the apostolic churches, that's when it's very clear they tend to be very misinformed. They tend to be the ones who don't dominate the conversation because they're very ignorant of the patristic period, of councils, of all that stuff. Whereas Catholics, Orthodox of various stripes tend to know a little bit more. So they tend to dominate those discussions and they generally come out on top in those discussions. Again, there's always exceptions. We're just talking here generally. Let me say this, though. Now, if you look on Twitter, everybody's like, man, that deacon just destroyed him. And it's true. I will say, though, it's not really hard to destroy a lot of these Protestants, to be honest. But be that as it may, you do often see that with Catholics and Orthodox. Anytime they're having a discussion with Protestants, they tend to kind of destroy their interlocutor. So we see that pretty often. But what I want to do today is I want to critique both sides, because I think that what we often miss is Because one side tends to dominate in these discussions, you might get the impression it's pretty straightforward and there's no debate here. But I want to show you actually there are some debates that you're more educated Catholics, educated Orthodox, and educated Protestants are aware of, but you might not get to see them in TikTok videos, Twitter videos, YouTube videos, because they tend to take place in academic circles, so they're not as visible. But the more educated are aware of these things and know it's not as clear cut as sometimes people would have you believe. Again, you won't know that if you just watch these discussions and you look and see, wow, it's so clear. I mean, this guy's dominating the discussion. I want to show you it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so, what I'm going to do today is critique both sides. And that's going to include not just the Oriental Orthodox, but that will include the Eastern Orthodox and also how many Catholics will present this information. And I want to show you it's not as clear cut as some people might have you think. And I do that so that you are aware of how to, um, that you're aware that some of these things, some of the arguments that are being presented online might not actually work with somebody who's a little bit more educated in this area. Again, I'm going to say the Oriental Orthodox deacon, he's a step up from Stuart and Cliffe. But what I want y'all as audience members, as viewers of this channel, what I want y'all to be is 10 steps above what you're seeing from the deacon, what you're seeing generally on YouTube, whether it's from Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Protestants. I want you to be 10 steps ahead of these guys so that you're aware of the complexity of some of these discussions. You realize it's not always as clear cut as some people would have you think. And that way you can start to formulate answers to these objections that tend to only come whenever you dig even deeper than we see often in these discussions. So I'm going to present some critiques here. They don't necessarily reflect my own personal beliefs, but I'm simply presenting them to show you an educated Protestant or an educated Eastern Orthodox or an educated Catholic might be aware of some of these things, and then they could say, well, what you're saying there is not entirely clear cut. There's a little bit more to that. You might want to refine your position here and there, reformulate it, because sooner or later, that's going to happen, whether you like it or not. People are going to come to you with objections that you haven't yet anticipated. An educated atheist might present them to you. An educated Protestant might present them to you. An educated Catholic, an educated Eastern Orthodox, whatever. They might present that to you. And if you're not already thinking about those objections, you're not going to have a response. And then you're going to get you're going to be the one dominated at that point. And your video will show up on YouTube and people will say, look how that guy got smoked and all that. So I want y'all to be 10 steps ahead of the stuff that you see online. And I want you to start thinking in terms of some of the things that I'm going to point out that show you it's a little bit more complicated than most apologists, most theologians, and most people online would have you believe. And I'm going to show you why. Okay. So, again, this is between Stuart, who is the son of Cliffe, and a deacon, Mihret Melaku, I guess is how you pronounce his last name. Let me say that the deacon did really well, conducted himself very well. I don't have any criticisms of the deacon there. Stuart, however, I don't know what's going on with him. First of all, the act, the way he walks and presents himself, and it seems like an act. It doesn't seem genuine. It doesn't seem authentic. You'll see what I mean whenever I start playing the video. It seems completely contrived, and it looks like he's imitating his father and his mannerisms. It's a little weird, and again, it seems artificial. I don't think that that's impressive. I don't think that's going to speak to people and scream out sincerity. In my opinion, it's a huge turnoff if I see a person acting in this kind of way. That's my personal opinion. Number two, more importantly, I don't like how Stuart got very defensive and even angry at some parts because he's ignorant and doesn't know how to respond to the deacon. Now, in reality, there are responses to the Oriental Orthodox deacon, and I'm going to point them out to you today, whether you like it or not. Some of y'all might not like to hear that there are responses to these things, but again, you're more educated Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox will point it out for you, even if you don't like it. And whenever Stuart couldn't answer something, he clearly gets frustrated. He was deflecting. I didn't like it. It was really off-putting, and I thought the deacon came across way better with his attitude and his mannerisms than how Stuart did. Be that as it may, that doesn't determine where the truth is. Somebody could behave in a way that's off-putting and still be in the right. So I'm not saying that he's wrong by that alone. We're going to consider what he has to say. And we're going to consider what both sides have to say. And we're going to interact with it. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen here. And let's watch part one. It's about 4 minutes before we dive into the other parts. I'll stop it after playing 4 minutes, the entire part. And then I will dive in and offer you some thoughts. But let me play through it one time without stopping so that you kind of get to see what it's like without any interruptions. Please let me know if there's any difficulty with hearing the audio. Put any difficulties that you experience in the comment section if you do experience any. Okay. And also let me know if there's echo or something like that. All right, let's dive in.
Yeah.
All right, hi. Get up real quick. So my name is Mihret. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and basically the question I had was directed basically to you and Cliffe, which is you've talked about your stance on baptism and the Eucharist, and how you believe that they're just basically symbolic, outward professions and not actually efficacious for salvation. And basically my critique or my question really is when we look at the extant records of the first, second, third century Christians, all of them say that these are efficacious for salvation, that they're not just symbolic, that they have an actual deifying effect on the person that receives them. So I guess my question is, how can you say that you're following what the Bible says if your interpretation of the Bible is not lining up with the people that directly received the Bible and even compiled the canon of the New Testament as we know it?
If that's true, then what's the history?
Somebody says the volume is too low. It is up all the way. So yeah, not sure how I can fix that for y'all. Let me do this. Let me pull up a different version of it. And let me see if that one has a better volume for y'all. 1 second. I'm looking here through the videos that I find online about this. I wonder if this one is any better. Let me play it for y'all, and please let me know if this one is better or no different than the previous one.
I'm Mihret. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and basically the question I had was directed basically to you and Cliffe, which is you've talked about your stance on baptism and the Eucharist and how you believe that they're just basically symbolic, outward professions and not as actually efficacious for salvation. And basically my critique or my question really is when we look at the extant records of the first, second, third century Christians, all of them say that these are efficacious for salvation, that they're not just symbolic, that they have an actual deifying effect on the person that receives them. So I guess my question is, how can you say that you're following what the Bible says if your interpretation of the Bible is not lining up with the people that directly received the Bible and even compiled the canon of the New Testament, you know?
If that's true, then what's the history of why so many millions upon millions don't think it's the case?
could argue the same thing about why so many people don't believe in the gospel. I mean, that's just
But who are the people? I want you to say the names, the church fathers, and who you're referring to on both sides of the fence.
Well, there's no both sides because we don't have any records of anyone that believes it's
So you're saying it's later with Luther?
Not even with Luther, because Luther famously said he would rather drink blood with the Pope than.
So then, how did it come about?
It came with Ulrich Zwingli and some of the radical reformers, which is like what 500 years ago. No.
What does it matter the dating?
What it matters is if we're believing in Christianity as historically the faith that Christ gave to the apostles, you would expect to find any records of first century Christians that lived in the time of the apostles that would believe the beliefs you have, right?
My friend, during that time period, not everybody thought that literally Jesus was eating his own body and drinking his own blood whenever they took communion. Well, not every Christian did, I can promise you historically. You got to check your historical facts on that.
The majority of the church fathers, you're exactly right. In terms of what they passed down, many of them did say that Jesus was actually in the bread and his blood was actually in the wine.
There aren't any records of anyone.
But to make that type of claim is just that's huge stretch.
It's not a stretch because every single one of the early church fathers say that it was actually his body, actually his blood. If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, St. Paul even says that those who didn't examine themselves properly before partaking of the Lord's Supper could die. If it's just mere bread and wine, why is St. Paul saying it was killing Christians that didn't examine themselves properly before partaking?
Why did he say what?
He said because some of you have not examined yourselves and are partaking unworthily, he says, some of you are sick and some of you sleep. This is in 1 Corinthians 11, meaning they died. They died from partaking it unworthily. So if it's just mere bread and wine, why is St. Paul saying it's killing Christians?
Excellent question. Contextually, because people were not doing it in such a way that was obviously worthy and in a worshipful manner towards God.
Right, but
just like women, when they were called to wear head coverings, it wasn't because there was a sexist time period involved being sexist, but it was because of orderliness of worship at the time.
Sure.
Because of the sex goddess, Diana.
No one,
how they were worshiping Diana. So obviously the Me Too movement and all the great movements that
uplifted women came from the Christian worldview. It's pretty hard to say that Christianity is sexist.
Well, nowhere in the scriptures.
So again, a lot of your type of thinking, which I really respect. I have friends as well who assume your type of thought when it comes to communion. A lot of them will land on this word truth. Because so many times when it comes to communion, it's truly I tell you this, truly I tell you that. And they'll say, God is not a God of deception. So truly he means it's really his body. I respect that. I really do. I think that makes a lot of sense. So I don't make a huge deal out of it. But to say transubstantiation, in order to be a strong Christian, or I hope you would never say saved, you have to actually believe in transubstantiation, which is the claim you're making.
That's where part one stops. So let me pause it there. Again, we're going to go through this in 3 parts. I wanted to play that whole bit for you so that, I'm not jumping in too much and you kind of get to see what's going on. But there's already a lot there for us to interact with. That's why I'm breaking it up into parts here. Okay, number 1. First of all, again, I appreciate the deacon's mannerisms and behavior a little bit more than what Stuart was doing there. Seems like he was overly defensive. Don't like the artificial walking, and it's just so weird. But again, that doesn't determine who's right? Just personally off-putting for me. And I don't know why he was shifting and switching to the Me Too stuff. It's like, you're deflecting, dude. Get back to it. It's clear you don't know what's going on, and you're out of your depth here, and you're posturing because you're basically feeling the heat. Now, when you watch that, again, clearly the deacon is more knowledgeable than the Protestant, but there are a lot of problems even with what the deacon is presenting. Now, what the deacon presents there is not something unique to Ethiopian Orthodoxy. This is what you're going to hear from most Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, some Anglicans, pretty standard stuff. But the standard narrative, even among the apostolic churches, isn't always entirely accurate and needs to be more refined. Because again, if you don't do it, a knowledgeable opponent will do it for you and embarrass you in the process. So it's good to go ahead and be aware of this stuff. So the deacon says records from the first, second, and third century from Christians. He asks, do any of them say that baptism and Eucharist are not efficacious for salvation? He wants to say that the records from the first, second, and third century, they all indicate baptism and Eucharist are efficacious for salvation. There's some general truth to that. Not always entirely true. You can poke some holes at that. For example, first of all, we have to point out there are not many documents from the first, second, and third century period. Not a whole lot has survived, right? So there could have been people who had different views, but they just didn't survive time. Now, that would be an argument from silence if you tried to argue for that. I recognize you can't argue from an argument of silence, but do be aware that we're very limited in what we have to begin with. And then even from what we do have, they don't always talk about these issues. Some of them do, though, and some of them do hold to an efficacious view of baptism, especially, and also of the real presence in the Eucharist. They're pretty vague and broad in their understanding of real presence. You're not necessarily going to get a transubstantiation view. They're not necessarily denying it either. They're just not thinking in Aristotelian terms. But you tend to get a real presence view from this time period. But the difficulty here is the victor's right history. And you need to be aware of that. The victor's right history, that doesn't mean the victors are wrong. That doesn't mean they're wrong. But be aware of the victor's right history. And the side that won out historically is the side that believes baptism is efficacious, real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. Those who denied those things, some of their works did not survive. Now, you might say, but wait, how do we even know that there were such people? We do know there were such people in the case of those who denied the real presence. And it seems like the deacon is not aware of that. And you can find out who these people are if you just simply read Ignatius of Antioch. You probably know who I'm talking about. The Gnostics. Gnostics deny the real presence. Now, you're automatically going to say, but wait, Gnostics are heretics. Right. Again, the victors write the history, and they deemed the Gnostics to be heretics. That's true. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. But what I'm saying is if the Gnostics had won out in history, they would have considered themselves the Orthodox, and they would say that those who believed in the real presence are the heretics. And their writings would have survived, and the writings of those who believed in the real presence probably would have been discarded. You got to think, look, when you preserve historical records from this time period, it's not very easy to do. It's incredibly expensive. And you also got to preserve it for 2,000 years now. That's a very expensive thing for society to preserve writings. Now, what are they going to be more inclined to preserve? Heretical writings or Orthodox writings? Orthodox writings. Right. Church fathers that they agreed with. Right. So you're likely going to see more from that perspective and less from the opposing views. Because again, they're not going to likely preserve the writings of heretics. Sometimes they did, sometimes, but not always. For example, we only have fragments of Pelagius's writings. He's a little bit later than the time period we're discussing here, about the 5th century or so. But we have only fragments, and what we know is really from basically what Augustine says about them. And what we know about the Gnostics is mostly from what Irenaeus or Ignatius and others say about them. So you're hearing what they said. Arius, we don't have Arius's writings. We know a little bit about Arius because of what Athanasius and others said about him. But mind you, you're getting the perspective of what Athanasius says Arius said. Is that always accurate? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know for sure because we don't actually have primary sources on Arius in many cases. This is the kind of stuff you need to think through. You need to be aware of these issues because if you're not thinking about it, I promise you, The atheists are thinking about this. The more educated Protestants are thinking about this. Yes, some Protestants don't convert to Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. And it's not because they haven't considered the issues. It's because they have considered the issues and they realize there are some difficulties here. Now, again, that's not to say there aren't sufficient responses to their objections. But what I'm saying is you need to be aware of this. And no, it's not always as clear cut. Also, do you ever just ask the question, is this patristic writing that I'm reading here authentic? Do you ever even ask that question? You should, because you would be shocked to find out how many forgeries we have in the last 2,000 years. And any student of church history, and especially the patristic period, is well aware of the use of forgeries at ecumenical councils, at the use of forgeries by church fathers. They didn't know that these were forgeries, but we do. And there's very good reasons why we know it, and we know that they're forgeries. If you were to just grab, the 38 volume set of church fathers that you had published at the turn of the 20th century, very famous set, 38 volumes of the Nicene, post-Nicene, and ante-Nicene fathers. I got it right over there on that shelf in front of me. If you were to just pull that, you can also find it on New Advent. Do you ever ask, wait, is this even an authentic work? Do you think that some of those people who compiled that edition were looking into those things in that kind of critical way? Not as much as some of the others after them were considering those questions. So later editions of those same church fathers and same writings might be a little bit different. And the editors there will point out, in this case, this particular chapter doesn't appear to be authentic, doesn't appear to actually derive from St. Gregory. It appears to have been added later, and here's why. They're thinking through those questions compared to some other generations that didn't necessarily do so. And you have to ask, are you thinking through that? Because here's the problem. If you're in a debate with somebody about the Trinity, and you say, Justin Martyr said X, Y, and Z, an educated opponent is going to come back and they will have already done their homework. And you don't want to be in a position where they have to point out to you, excuse me, the scholars of your own church community say that part of Justin Martyr is not authentic to Justin, and here's why. And you need to be prepared to address that. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe it is authentic, but you need to have a good argument to show why it's authentic. You can't just assume that. Okay, so those are the questions you need to think through. So, number 2, the question was raised, are there those who held to the real presence? Or no, the deacon asserted that those who held to the real presence in the early church are the ones who directly receive the Bible. Maybe he just misspoke because he's speaking off the cuff. I do that all the time. Is that true, though? We might hear that pretty often, but the church fathers, the apostolic fathers, ante-Nicene fathers who hold to the real presence or an efficacious view of baptismal regeneration, are they the ones who directly receive the Bible? Because his argument is they're the ones who directly inherited the Bible, therefore their interpretation is authoritative. Well, a couple of problems. Number one, they don't always have the same interpretation on very important issues. So, and by the way, I don't know how many times I can preface things. It's like, there's a problem with doing live streams, and that is you get people who jump in on the live stream and they don't know what's going on, and they haven't figured out yet. Hit the rewind button and start from the beginning. It's one of the reasons why I'm really gonna stop doing live streams pretty soon, because I'm just kind of tired of this. This person is like, wait, what? That's what James White said about Ignatius. Is Michael playing a Protestant view right now? As I said at the beginning of the video that you didn't watch, the beginning of this video, I'm not presenting arguments that I personally believe necessarily. I am presenting counter arguments that you will encounter from critics. And if you're not thinking through these things, they will embarrass you in a conversation. Do you understand? Let's move forward. So, but James White and the did Ignatius of Antioch actually write this? That's a perfect example. Perfect example. He was saying, well, some people don't believe that this was actually written by Justin of Antioch. Right. So now you need to be able to engage the question, is this actually authentic? Now, it very well could be that what you're pointing to in Ignatius is authentic. And it very well may be that James White and others are wrong in putting it into doubt if they do so. The point is you need to be able to show that. You can't just assume it. Just because it says on the book, Ignatius of Antioch, are you serious? I show you other editions that won't have those parts in them. Because the people who compiled it came to different conclusions on what was authentic. You might have different manuscripts of this particular work from a church father, and they're conflicting, and some have this chapter and some don't. And so they have to examine it critically and determine, is this authentic to them or not? You have to be prepared to engage those questions. Because if you're not, your opponent may be, and they'll embarrass you. Okay. Did the people who maintained the real presence in the early church and the efficacious view of baptism, are they the ones who inherited the canon, the Bible, I should say? There's a lot of problems with this argument. Number one, they don't always agree on very important issues. So you can't alone point to them as the standard, right? If you're going to point to a certain group of church fathers as the standard of orthodoxy, you're not always going to be successful in getting where you want to go, whether you're a Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, or Oriental Orthodox, or Anglican for that matter. You won't get to where you want to go because they're not always going to agree on certain issues that your community says are essential doctrine. Sometimes they might, sometimes they don't. So we have a difficulty here because I think he's kind of assuming a premise that is not necessarily the case. But there's a grain of truth to what he's saying. I mean, if your interpretation is completely absent from church history, that does increase the difficulty for your interpretation. It doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. Maybe that was the true interpretation and it just didn't survive in some of the manuscripts we have. You might want to argue that. I would have some counters to that, but you might want to argue that. But okay. But if it is conspicuously absent, that does put you in a more difficult position. And so I think that the deacon is right to point out, well, if a dominant view is one of efficacious baptism and a real presence, and we don't seem to have a whole lot of people denying it, he indicates we don't have anyone, but that's not true. We do have people denying it. What do you do at that point? I think he's right to point to it, but it's not a slam dunk for the reasons why I'm mentioning here. But the people who are holding to a view of real presence, efficacious baptism, so baptismal regeneration, are generally going to be the ones who hold to apostolic succession. And so Irenaeus, in fact, will employ this argument in his work against heresies, against the Gnostics. And he'll say, look, we're kind of the inheritors of the apostles because our churches were established by the apostles and the apostles never taught us. And our churches never received and inherited this doctrine that you Gnostics have. Insofar as they're claiming apostolic succession, you might be able to argue they're indirectly inheritors of the New Testament by that line of reasoning. But you can't directly argue that these apostolic fathers, in many cases, and especially the ante-Nicene fathers, so 3rd century and so on, they're not necessarily directly inheritors of the New Testament, because the New Testament was written down before most of them were born. So they're more indirectly inheritors of the New Testament, and you might argue via apostolic succession and the apostolic preaching in apostolic churches. Now, the further difficulty here is that Gnostics would also claim to be inheritors of the scriptures. Now, they might have different canons. Marcion is certainly going to have a different canon of the New Testament than, say, Irenaeus. But they're also going to claim to be inheritors of Scripture. And you might say, well, in that case, they don't have apostolic succession. I don't know if that's entirely true, but let's just go ahead and say that, right? Let's just go ahead and assume for a moment, Gnostic communities, they don't have apostolic succession. I think that could be challenged, but okay. That doesn't account for other heretical groups, though, non-Gnostic heretical groups in the ante-Nicene period who did have apostolic succession. Paul of Samosata and his group, Arius and their group, right? They were from churches that had apostolic succession. So simply claiming apostolic succession or coming from a church, going back to the apostles, doesn't necessarily seal the deal on the question. And they're going to claim to be inheritors of the New Testament as well, and the apostolic preaching as well. Arius is going to claim that as much as Athanasius. Again, Paul of Samosata will claim that just as much as the next guy. Origen would claim that just as much as the next guy. So it might get you down the road a few steps further by appealing to apostolic succession, but it's not the slam dunk that you think it is, and that the Deacon presents it to be. Ike Jedediah says, what I like about Michael is that he is making us look at all possible angles. Exactly. Because if I don't do that for you, other people will. And when I watch these videos, I'm thinking of it from every possible angle, because I'm trying to be fair and consistent and balanced. I try to have a systematic view of things. I don't want to compartmentalize my views to where, okay, I have this figured out over here, then I got this thing figured out over there, but the reasoning that I use to come to this is completely at odds and contradictory to the reasoning that I have to figure this out. And so, but I still hold it, but no, that's not going to work systematically. You have to have the same reasoning, same consistency if it's true, right? So you also need to be aware to think through things critically, be aware of responses. And so you want to kind of steelman your opponent, and you want to think through responses to a steelman criticism to your perspective. That's what I'm trying to help people do here. The Deacon seemed to suggest that the fathers from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century are the ones who compiled the canon. That's not exactly true. You do have some compilations of the canon in this time period, but they're not all the same. And there's certainly no official canon in this time period. Even if you want to point to something like the councils of Rome, Carthage, and Hippo, which are past the time period that he was describing here, even if you want to point to their compilation of the canon, I do have to point out, as I've indicated in other streams and shown to y'all with the primary sources, there's some of the church fathers, even after Carthage, Rome, Hippo, held the different views of the canon. So while those councils at the turn of the late fourth century, early 5th century, in that time period, though that did help standardize many of the books of the Bible, it didn't slam dunk seal the deal for everyone. because you got John of Damascus in the East, Damascene, saying that the apostolic constitutions, I think, not or First Clement or both, I forget which, are part of the New Testament. Right? So you got, and he's not the only one. He's not the only one. You got Trullo suggesting that the apostolic constitutions are apostolic in nature, like actually written by the apostles. And if you go and read the apostolic constitutions, it suggests that it's written by Clement, and First Clement is scripture, which is why some of the early church Christians believe in First Clement as scripture, and that the apostolic constitutions themselves are scripture. This is just one example among many. So not only is the deacon wrong, these are not necessarily the people who compiled the canon. You couldn't, even if that were true, you couldn't even point to that as somehow a slam dunk against the Protestants, because you still have the canon in dispute after those local councils. They're not really at least settled in the West until Florence and Trent. You might have less debate on the canon after the 5th century, but you still have some outliers here and there disagreeing, and they don't necessarily see those councils as definitive in nature. Now, also, if the deacon is right, of you got to go to these people who compiled the canon, the people of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, you got to go to them. They're the ones who, and the inheritors of the Bible. Then why is it that Catholics, Orthodox, and Ethiopian Orthodox can't agree on the canon? Because both Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Oriental Orthodox, including the Ethiopian Orthodox, are going to appeal to the same time period, not always to the same church fathers. And that's part of the problem, right? Who's a church father? They're not always the same for all these communities. But they're going to appeal to the same time period. They're going to all appeal to apostolic succession, but they don't come up with the same canon. Why is that? And an educated critic is going to just point that out to you inconveniently. And he's going to say, some Eastern Orthodox hold to the Deuterocanon. Some reject it. See the Philaric, the Philaric Catechism, is it? Let me double check. Yeah, the longer catechism of the Orthodox Church, Philaret's catechism, Philaret in Moscow. Check that one, and you'll see a very curious view on the canon. So the Eastern Orthodox don't have a consistent canon. The Ethiopian Orthodox have a different canon than the rest of their Oriental Orthodox brothers. The Ethiopian Orthodox have 81 books in their canon. They hold to the Apostolic Constitutions, First Clement, and other books in the New Testament. First Enoch, and none of the other churches hold to that. But if his argument were true, all you got to do is go to those church fathers who were inheritors of the New Testament, then you wouldn't have these differences in the canon. Now, Stuart tried to say in response, so if what you're saying is true, Deacon, why do so many not agree with your view on baptism and the Eucharist? That was a response, really? Well, I mean, a person could just simply say because people are ignorant, because they use themselves as the standard of the truth instead of some standard of authority like church fathers or tradition or a magisterium, or because people are dumb. I mean, that's why. The majority of people believe some really wild stuff. Majority of people think abortion is perfectly fine, right? And so, and we're talking majority of people who identify as Christians. That's a really bad counter from Stuart. So, but you can see he's at a disadvantage. Stuart has not studied church history 101, not even from a Protestant perspective, let alone from anything else. And so he doesn't know what to say to any of this. And so the deacon's going to look like, oh man, he's got all the answers. Well, he's just giving you kind of the standard stuff that you'll see all over on, Twitter and stuff like that. And that might be good enough for the average person. It's not good enough for me because I know the critics are just going to point out all the things that I just brought up. Now, Stuart then asks, like, okay, so who's the first person to deny the real presence? And it seems like the Deacon was suggesting Zwingli, in the 16th century. That's incorrect. Number one, the Gnostics. Same, first century. In the first century, you have Gnostics denying it. And again, you might say they're heretics. Exactly. Exactly. But if they had one out, they would say they're the Orthodox, and people who hold to the real presence are the heretics. But you can't deny that they existed. They're there. And you also have others debating the question of real presence. Ratramnus and Radbertus. 800s, 900s, right around there. Been a while since I read their back and forth. You might argue, well, they kind of both believe in a real presence of some sorts. You might make that argument. But you do have, even before Zwingli and before Luther, not that Luther necessarily denied the real presence, you do have people denying the Catholic understanding of the real presence prior to Zwingli and Luther. So you have that. I wouldn't necessarily say it's kind of Zwingli who came up with it. Be that as it may, they tended to believe in the real presence in the early church. The majority tended to, and especially through the Middle Ages up until the Reformation. There tended to be, by standard default view, of real presence. It was very undefined. It wasn't very specific. And there are wide ranges here in views on real presence. Keep in mind, John Calvin says that he believes in the real presence, but it's a real spiritual presence. And Catholics and Orthodox are going to be like, yeah, that's not good enough. But he thinks he believes in the real presence. Presbyterians think they believe in real presence. So real presence is kind of a broad category. It's not until much later that you start to get more defined views like transubstantiation. Now, then the Deacon brings up 1 Corinthians, and he asks, why would the people die if they were receiving the Eucharist unworthily, if the Eucharist is not really the body and blood of Jesus? Here's the problem with that argument. I've used that argument many times. Just be aware that there are responses to that you need to take into account. And so you're gonna have to go a step further than just kind of throwing that out as a slam dunk, 1 Corinthians 11, thinking that settles the issue. Because all a critic has to do is say, look at the Old Testament. When you had people not coming to God properly in worship, think of the sons of Eli, the priests, 2 priests, abusing the liturgy. God killed them because they did not come to the liturgy right. And they were altering some of the aspects of the liturgy. And so they weren't dealing with it properly. God took it seriously and killed them. Does that somehow mean that the sacrifices that they were mishandling were real presence? Of course not. Obviously not. The animal sacrifices weren't real presence of Jesus at the time. But God killed them for mishandling animal sacrifices. Why? Because they were coming improperly to worship. So a critic could just say in 1 Corinthians 11, well, these people are coming improperly to worship, and so that's why they're dying. So you got to show why you think that 1 Corinthians 11 proves real presence, because all a Protestant or all a atheist or all just any kind of critic has to do is just say, no, all it shows is that God will kill you if you come to him inappropriately during worship, just like he did in the Old Testament. Doesn't necessarily mean real presence. If it teaches real presence, you need to add further arguments to demonstrate that from 1 Corinthians 11. I'm not saying it doesn't teach that. I'm saying you need to add additional arguments. That's what I'm saying. Inevitably, some low IQ guy will come along and say, Michael just denied real presence is in 1 Corinthians 11. No, If that's what you took away from me, stop it. Turn the video off. Go read Dr. Seuss. This isn't for you. This isn't for you. This isn't your angle. It's not what I said. What I said is the arguments that people tend to use are not sufficient to show what is being claimed for the very reason I just mentioned. So if you're going to claim a real presence argument from 1 Corinthians 11, you need to add some additional argumentation to account for the counter response. Okay. Okay. I think there was one other part for that before we go to part 2. Stuart says that he doesn't make a big deal out of the question of the real presence of the Eucharist. Well, maybe he doesn't, right? But many people do. Catholics do. Orthodox do. Oriental Orthodox do. Some Anglicans do. Some of them are going to consider this absolutely, like essential doctrine. It's dogmatic. Stuart may not, but others do. So how do you determine what's a big deal and what isn't? That's an important question to ask. Because, yeah, you can come along and say, well, mere Christianity agree to disagree on this issue. How do you know that this is an agree to disagree thing? Is the Trinity an agree to disagree thing? Is prayer an agree to disagree thing? Is inerrancy agree to disagree? Is the Gospel of John agree to disagree? How do you know what is an area that agree to disagree and an area where you say, no, this is essential? Now, I know the answer for Catholics. It's going to be the magisterium. But for the Eastern Orthodox, I don't think they have an answer. I don't think the Oriental Orthodox have an answer. I definitely know the Protestants don't have an answer. Those are questions they need to think through. Let's go on to part 2 here. Take a look at it. So we're going to watch another 4 minutes, and then I will review that after playing through the whole thing.
That's not the thing. I don't believe in the scholastic idea of transubstantiation, but I do believe in the real presence. And my argument...
I believe that there's presence there.
Well, that it's actually his body and his blood.
That's transubstantiation.
No, transubstantiation is the metaphysical idea that the substance goes from being the substance of bread and wine to the substance,
but
right?
It's connected.
But you could believe in consubstantiation like Lutherans believe.
Sure.
You could believe in other metaphysical
So are
things.
those salvific? You need to believe in those.
No. What I think is necessary is to believe in the faith of the apostles, and they believe that was truly his body and his blood. That's all.
So if you don't believe in what the apostles teach on communion specifically, that the body is the actual body in the bread,
right,
and the blood in the wine, then are you not saved?
So I think you're kind of viewing salvation as a one-time thing, which I think in and of itself is a Protestant worldview. I think the patristic understanding of the early Christians is that salvation is union with God. So it's a process, and part of that
based off of works and tradition.
What do you mean by works?
You're saying it's a process. Salvation is.
Salvation is a process.
Sounds like works versus a one-time decision,
right,
to lay everything at the foot of the cross and say, Jesus, I am unworthy. Right. I need your saving grace. You save me. Right. When I hear you say process, that makes me very nervous, my friend.
Well,
very nervous.
You see in the
because now it is becoming a salvation issue.
Well, if you see in the writings of St. Paul, he talks about how we were saved.
Yes.
He also says you're being saved. And he also said that you will be saved on the last day.
Exactly right.
So this is a
justification,
it's a past,
and
present,
sanctification.
But the word being used is salvation and all.
But we also have to remember that in the Bible it says, "By grace you have been saved."
Of course, and we believe that.
We
believe that. But if we believe that salvation is synergistic, which means it's a cooperation of energies, there's the energy of God, which is grace. But then we must also cooperate with the grace of God and be faithful to Him, right? That's why in fact, Cliffe quoted in Philippians chapter 2. It says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. There's the faithfulness. In Romans 4, when St. Paul quotes Genesis and he says that Abraham believed and it was counted to him as righteousness, he's quoting Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, which is 3 chapters after Abraham was already called. He had done stuff. He was faithful to God. That was how he was able to demonstrate his belief. It wasn't just empty faith. It wasn't just he came to an altar call, stretched out his hand and said, I believe. He expressed it.
What about the thief on the cross?
The thief on the cross.
Did he express it after years and years and years? There was a process, and all of a sudden he was saved.
That's a good point. But consider the circumstances. He was nailed on the cross. There was nothing he could do.
It was all circumstantial.
It's all God condescends to what we can
Jesus
do.
is all about just circumstantial. That's all he's about.
No, God condescends to what you can do. Consider the parable of the 3 servants. Each one was given in accordance with what he could do. One was given 1 talent.
Yes.
One was given 2. One was given 5. The
You
person,
much to be expected.
I would never say, for instance, that an uncontacted Amazonian tribe is going to hell, right? Because God condescends in accordance to what they can do, right? Or the person who on his deathbed says, I believe in Christ, I'm not going to say he's going to go to hell because he wasn't baptized. But for all of us in this room who can, we ought to be faithful. It says in Mark chapter 16, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. So, and I also want to preface all of this, that my question to you is more epistemological. Like, I could offer my own opinion of Scripture. You can offer your own opinion of Scripture. But we should interpret a text based on the people who wrote it, the people who directly received that writing, right?
Yep.
The consensus of the people at that time.
All right, let's stop there. A lot going on here. Well, there isn't always a consensus of people in this time period. So the deacon is overstating the case. Sometimes there is a consensus on some matters, not always, and certainly not in the areas that he would like for there to be consensus. And the same can be said for what Catholics and Eastern Orthodox would want to be an area where there would you would want consensus. There isn't always consensus among the church fathers. This is not shocking. This is not new information. Anyone who's well educated in the patristic period already knows this. But there is a general sense in which you can point to consensus among the church fathers in some cases. And some of the popes talk about that. Leo XIII speaks of the consensus patrum. The Council of Trent speaks about it as well. So there's some truth to it in some cases. But he's overstating the case as if it's just like, it's so clear cut. These church fathers are the ones who inherited the scriptures. No, they didn't. Most of them were obviously not alive whenever the New Testament was written. So at the very least, you can argue they indirectly inherited the scriptures via apostolic succession. But even then, you have heretical groups who have apostolic succession. The Oriental Orthodox are going to consider Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and also the Assyrian Church of the East to be heretics to one degree or another. But all those have apostolic succession. So it's not as clear cut as he's going to have you believe here. The discussion there on justification and salvation, all of that. If I had hair, I would rip my hair out. Maybe I can rip my beard hair out instead, which is a lot more painful, by the way. It's always frustrating to listen to this because both sides here are misinformed and are speaking on such a superficial level that neither are very productive in the conversation. But they don't seem to know enough about the situation to realize it. And I'm not trying to pick on just the Protestants and just the Eastern Oriental Orthodox, the Ethiopian Orthodox here, because I could say the exact same thing about conversations between Catholics and Protestants and Eastern Orthodox and Protestants. 99.9% of the time, whenever you hear a discussion on justification, salvation, it's so superficial, and they tend to talk about it from an area that is just, they're not really getting to the heart of the actual debate, but they don't realize it. I've done too many shows at this point on the question of justification for me to rehash that here, but I'll just simply say this, that it's not just so simple as, oh, it's a question of faith and works. There's a lot more to it than that. You can't just say, well, you work out your salvation with fear and trembling and quote the New Testament, and others will say, no, Romans 1, it's not for the one who works, but the one who believes it. Is so much deeper than that. Here you can see Stuart is starting to think that, this is a situation where it's now starting to touch on a matter pertaining to salvation. In other words, the deacon is starting to compromise on essential doctrine, putting his salvation in jeopardy. And by the way, Yankee Films, thank you for that super chat. Kind of begs the question to Stuart, like, how do you know this is an essential doctrine? Like, you feel this understanding of justification is essential. How do you know that? His Ordo Salutis, which would be, I suspect, regeneration, justification, sanctification, glorification, adoption, I guess, thrown in at the same time as justification. I suspect that would be his Ordo Salutis. I'm sure he would hold to that as like dogmatic, like this is essential. How do you determine that as a Protestant? Because there's a lot of other Protestants who are going to say, no, I don't agree with that Ordo Salutis. I don't believe that this is an area that is absolutely essential. This isn't mere Christianity. We can agree to disagree. It's not for, this is not a salvation issue. So it depends on what Protestant you ask. So again, how do you know? The way the deacon is attempting to respond, well, salvation is a thing that's an ongoing process. It's mentioned in passive, or in the past sense, in the present sense, in the future sense in the New Testament, which is true, but that doesn't settle the question. I think you have to get into the question that Trent really starts to get into in the Counter-Reformation, and that is the distinction between initial justification and justification post-initial justification or ongoing justification. And then the ground for it, the meritorious cause and the various causes of justification that Trent gets into, and it makes the proper distinctions there. I think you'll find the answers in Trent because it's really taking the conversation into account in a more in-depth way than most of these conversations go, and it's making the proper distinctions. I think that would be a better way to handle this. Now, obviously, the deacon's not going to do that because he doesn't hold to the Council of Trent. He thinks it's a heretical council. So he's not going to be able to do that from his angle. And most of the Oriental Orthodox have not settled the question of justification in any kind of in-depth way. So you'll find discussions and debates even between the Oriental Orthodox and even the Ethiopian Orthodox on these issues. In fact, you'll find a tremendous amount of diversity among just the the Ethiopian Orthodox in matters of the Trinity and Christology. So, and that's just one area of theology. There's many others. Which would kind of bring us to the question of authority and how do you know what's the essential doctrine from his perspective as well. Okay. I did find it interesting. Stuart doesn't appear to be aware of the difference between transubstantiation and other views of real presence. He just assumed if you believe in real presence, you believe in transubstantiation. It's like, come on, this is such a rookie move. You're going to be out there dancing around, doing the step forward, and you do this motion, and you believe this and that. If you got that whole act down, at least know some of the basics here on questions like real presence and that there's different views. Like, you got the mannerisms down, but you don't have everything else that goes with it, it would seem. So I was a little surprised to see he's not even aware of that. The deacon then just points out, yeah, no, I don't believe in transubstantiation. I believe in another mode of real presence. It was a little unspecified what mode, but it wasn't transubstantiation. Then Stuart gets into the question of, is salvation a process? Does it involve works? I mean, from the Catholic perspective, not necessarily from the deacon's Ethiopian Orthodox perspective, not that there is just one perspective anyway among them. From the Catholic perspective, according to the Council of Trent, so initial justification, that a moment where a person is translated from being in a state of a son of Adam to a state of the son of the second Adam, from being under God's wrath to now in God's favor, from being, condemned to being justified. That person, that happens, that initial justification happens instantly. It's not a process, and it does not happen by any merit on part of the individual. It is by faith. It's not a dead faith. It is a working faith, a faith working in love. It's the theological virtue of faith for the Council of Trent, but it's not merited by works. And insofar as the Catholic says that, there is some agreement with the Protestant, but not entirely, because the Protestant wants to say justification is just a one-time thing, whereas the Catholic is going to say, no, there is initial justification, which is a one-time thing, but then there's ongoing justification, and that's not exactly the same as sanctification. at least depending on how you define sanctification. Ongoing justification is a justification. It's not only a declaration of righteousness, it's actually an infusion of righteousness. And ongoing justification is based on grace and works done in love, works done in grace. And that can be further merited. For the Protestant, they think, wait, how can you further merit heaven? Well, there's degrees of heaven. There's degrees of reward in heaven, and that is what is being merited by ongoing justification. So this is how the Council of Trent and the Catholic would articulate the distinctions here. Stuart doesn't appear to be aware of any of this, so he's just going for the standard stereotypical arguments. It's by faith, not works, and it's like, yeah, this just doesn't get to it. Okay. And also I would point out there's a distinction between faith and how faith is applied and the works of redemption is applied. They tend to just think of, I'm here talking about Protestants, justification in terms of what Jesus merited, which of course Catholics adhere to as well in the Council of Trent. But there's a distinction between the grounds of justification and the meritorious cause and the application of justification. That's when you start to have works and stuff like that and sacraments in the Catholic system. And Protestants aren't even thinking in those terms of making a distinction. They tend to think, well, if Jesus merited it, that's it. Well, yeah, he merited the justification, but how then is it applied? Those are questions that they need to be aware of. He then asks the stereotypical counterpoint. What about the thief on the cross? You hear it every time, right? Either in the justification thing or the baptism thing. It's like, you haven't even bothered listening to, I'm talking Stuart here. He hasn't even bothered listening to anybody who doesn't adhere to his view. Which my thing is, do that before you go out and start speaking in public. You should already know what the person is going to say in response to this. You haven't even bothered to do that. Yeah, Catholics, Orthodox, they're everybody's aware of the thief on the cross. They have an answer. They've accounted for it. What about that? Well, as the deacon rightly points out, okay, in his particular situation, he doesn't have time to work out his salvation, so it's not going to be a factor. There's some partial truth to that, but what he's missing here is the distinction between initial and ongoing justification. Ongoing justification, that involves works. Initial justification doesn't. According to the Catholic Church, Benedict XVI, Council of Trent, that does not involve works. So all the thief on the cross had to do to inherit eternal life on the cross and to be initially justified was believe in Jesus, the theological virtue of faith. Yes, it's a faith that's not empty. Yes, it's a faith working in love, but if it doesn't have time to work in love, God is still going to accept it. And so there it is. That explains the thief on the cross. It's not that hard. And so, but that's more from a Catholic perspective. Again, you got to keep in mind, Oriental Orthodox don't have a Council of Trent, and they haven't had something analogous to that, or do they have something analogous to the Catholic magisterium? So they're not going to have an absolutely ironed out answer. What the Oriental Orthodox tend to do, just like the Eastern Orthodox, if they're going to respond to the Protestants, they just borrow from the arguments that many Catholics use. Not always. Like, obviously, they don't borrow from transubstantiation. But a lot of times, they're just going to borrow from the arguments that the counter-reformers used, and then they just borrow that in Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy. Okay. Let's continue here. Oh, by the way, he did mention Mark 16, the longer ending of Mark, and he just threw that one as if it's a slam dunk. We're talking here about Deacon to Stuart. And of course, a critic at that point would question the longer ending of Mark. Many Catholics are going to adhere to it, saying that that is absolutely essential to adhere to, and they'll make an argument based on the Council of Trent, saying that the Vulgate in all of its parts, and they'll say Mark 16 is one of them. Other Catholics will contest that. and say that doesn't logically follow. But you also have plenty of Orthodox and other, non-Oriental Orthodox, and probably also Oriental Orthodox, who would dispute the longer ending of Mark as well. And so you can't just throw it out. He brought up Mark, was it 16:15? I think it was. Let's double check. Mark 16:15. Those of you who believe and are baptized will be saved, I think is what it is. He brought that up. Let's see. I'm double checking. Don't know why my internet is so slow. This is weird. Sorry. Thought I could look it up really quickly here. Evidently not. Let me just do this. Mark 16:16. So yeah, Mark 16:16. This is part of the longer ending of Mark. Some people are going to dispute its authenticity, so you can't just throw this out there as a slam dunk for baptismal regeneration, because it won't work for people who don't accept the longer ending of Mark. So that gets you into a whole bigger debate on, is the longer ending of Mark authentic? And you might be biting off more than you can chew at that point to even get into that debate. So be aware. Don't be prepared to bring that up unless you're prepared to also defend the longer ending of Mark as being authentic. Okay, so let's continue with the last bit here.
And there isn't anyone who can find in terms of extant records that proves what you believe.
So then you believe in the infallibility of the councils.
Are you talking about the ecumenical councils?
The infallibility of the councils.
The council is a very general thing.
Oh yes, there's many different councils that talk about this very topic that we're talking about.
Right. But that's
and the infallibility of the councils make these claims, and they've changed over time, just like Vatican I, II, and III.
I don't believe in those. And there's no Vatican III.
This conversation totally breaks down. If you don't believe in the councils and you don't believe in the Vatican.
No. I'm not a Catholic. I'm an Orthodox Christian.
Orthodox Christian, okay, but still, this conversation starts to break down, because the infallibility of the councils that you're talking about based off of the Church Fathers' claim and the councils that they had,
right,
where they said this is infallible, this is based off this tradition, which is connected to Scripture.
Right.
There's an internal contradiction because they changed.
First off, they didn't change, and second off, the question I'll ask for you is, you believe in a New Testament canon.
Vatican I and Vatican II didn't change.
Why do you keep offering that to me? I believe that those are heretical councils. I'm not a Catholic.
Okay, but you're pushing me though on the Church Fathers.
No, I'm pushing you specifically on the Christians in the first and second. If you can point to me to anyone in the first or second century whose records are preserved, because I'll grant you that maybe someone had written about it and got destroyed. We don't have any extant records of anyone that's saying what you're saying or what Cliffe is saying. It's not at all. That said that the Eucharist is symbolic, or that baptism is symbolic, or that it's a one-time belief. All of these things you're talking about came out of the blue 500 years ago. So I'm asking you, where's the continuity? Where's the historical continuity?
I've looked at all the historical records that I see of the earliest Christians, the thousands upon thousands of Jews who became Christian overnight after the resurrection. Everything related to communion, nowhere does it say specifically they thought the bread was actually Jesus' body. Jesus could have been there with them the night before his death, and Jesus was taking part in this communion. So what that meant was, when he stretched out his hand to grab the bread, to dip it in the wine, then he was taking a piece of his kneecap, dipping it in some of the blood that perhaps was pouring out of his arm, and then eating himself, ingesting himself.
That's a very
So a lot of different Protestants would say it's just completely contradictory. But my friend, for you to stand up here and say the earliest Christians all thought exactly that Jesus was saying body, physical body, equates directly to the bread, wine directly to the blood. I think you don't know what you're really saying right now.
I can list for you all
because I agree with the Church Fathers. Yes, many of them. St. Augustine, you're exactly right.
Augustine came 400 years after.
Right.
I'm talking about Justin Martyr, Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, Athenagoras, Irenaeus. All of them, none of them line up with what you're saying. And you could go ahead and say, well, those are just people. But I'm asking you, point me for one person, even one person, in that time that said the things you believe in. Because right now what's happening is you're interpreting the scripture based on what you think is the case. Why that's so profoundly dangerous is because in another campus, there could be someone else saying the exact opposite of what you're saying based on their own understanding. Rather, we should appeal to the context in any text, including scripture, but any other text.
So who's the ultimate authority for you?
For me, the ultimate authority?
Yeah.
Wow.
The body of Christ, the church.
What's
The same
What's
body.
the church?
That's a good question. So now we can get to the councils if we want.
No. I need a straight answer from you now.
Yes.
This is going on too long from my perspective.
Okay.
What's the ultimate authority for you?
The ultimate authority is Christ and his body, the church.
No.
Yes.
What did you mean when you say the church? Heresy. What does
That's
that
not
mean?
heresy at all, huh?
What does that mean, the church?
The church as the concrete body. St. Paul spells out a tripartite hierarchy of authority. There's the bishop, there's the elder or the presbyter, and there's the deacon. The conglomeration or the council of all these bishops who received authority directly from the apostles, that is the body of Christ. That's
Who's
the
the head
church.
bishop?
The head bishop. Well, in any given region, there's a head bishop. I don't believe in the church.
Good.
Okay.
Good to meet you, brother. Keep going.
Oh, where do we begin? Let me begin with this one. I spotted the Orthodox in the chat. Let me teach them some humility. He says, Roman Catholics mastered in forgery early church fathers' documents for the sake of their improvised dogmas. And because of centuries, Roman Catholics improvised dogmas. We're facing lots of problematic teachings of Protestants. Okay. Again, let me teach you some humility since you want to come to my chat and offer this stupidity. So maybe you're not aware, but in Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy, there are forgeries as well. In all circles, there are forgeries. It's not just Catholics. It's Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. Regardless of the ecumenical councils that you hold to, some of those councils used forgeries to justify their dogmas. You might not want to hear that, but that's the truth. That doesn't mean that their dogmas are wrong. But it is a fact that some of the ecumenical councils, regardless of which community you're part of, regardless of how many you hold to, whether we're talking about Ephesus, whether we're talking about Chalcedon, or we're talking later, if you're one of the apostolic churches, you hold to some of the ecumenical councils, guess what? Whatever community you come from, some of your councils base their dogmas in part on forgeries, unknowingly. That doesn't mean they're wrong, but that is a fact you have to grapple with. I've demonstrated it at great length, and many scholars have as well. Go and look at any edition of the Acts of the ecumenical councils, and they'll have those discussions. You have Ephesus quoting Apollinarius. Actually, they quote who they think is Athanasius or Pope Julian. It turns out to be Apollinarius. They don't know it's Apollinarius, but they think it's Athanasius or Pope Julian. That's Ephesus, Third Ecumenical Council. You got that going on at Chalcedon. Well before situations involving Nicaea II or Photius and some of his forgeries at Constantinople IV. So you need some humility here, because all an educated critic has to do is point out that whatever community you belong to, and I don't know which it is, but I can tell you, whatever community it is, you have forgeries in your community, in its councils, use forgeries unknowingly, in part, to justify their dogmas. Again, that doesn't mean they're wrong. But it's something you need to be aware of. Okay. A lot going on in what we just witnessed with, what's his name? Cliffe jumping in there at the end, which I thought was kind of sad. So he jumps in there aggressively. He says, this has gone on too long. I got to step in. I don't think it's an issue of this has gone on too long. I think this is an issue of it's looked really bad for Stuart, his son. So yeah, it looked really bad, and so he had to jump in. By the way, one other point on the forgeries that I forgot to mention is for the Catholic position, all of its dogmas, you don't have to depend on forgeries for them. You could just simply depend on the authentic acts of the ecumenical councils that Eastern Orthodox accept, and some of which the Oriental Orthodox accept, like the Council of Ephesus, which adhered to the dogma of papal primacy. So, yeah, you don't have to rely on forgeries to get to the Catholic dogmas. So, yeah, the whole forgery thing is really ran out of gas. I spent a whole chapter on it in my book, Answering Orthodoxy, on the question of, but what about forgeries? It doesn't get you where you want to go as a critic of Catholicism. Just saying. Believe me, there are a lot of better arguments you can use against the Catholic Church than the forgery argument. Way better arguments. Okay, so let's get to that last bit there. So he jumps in, says it's taken too long. The deacon at the beginning of that part before Cliffe jumped in says basically, Stuart, what you hold to, it's just, it wasn't believed before, it's out of the blue 500 years ago. I don't like Protestantism. I'm a former Protestant. I don't like it. I think in many ways, it's repulsive in some ways. But I will say that you can't just write off some of the reformers as just uneducated idiots who don't know about the church fathers and the councils. In reality, some of the Protestant reformers are more aware of the church fathers and councils than 99% of Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, to be honest. They're aware of issues that most Catholics and Orthodox are not aware of. Your more educated Catholics are aware of these things. But your average Catholic, the majority of Catholics, even the ones who do apologetics and all that, they're not aware of some of the reasons why the Protestant reformers concluded what they did. And it's not because they just threw the church fathers out. No, that's overly simplifying the situation. They saw difficulties with some of the church fathers and with some of the councils. Going through my lectures that I did on the 21 ecumenical councils, going through and teaching the canons and the decrees, all of the sessions, it's interesting how you end up seeing what some of the complaints of the reformers were. It doesn't mean their arguments were right, but it's like, okay, I see why Luther was complaining here about this and that council. What he didn't account for, however, is X, Y, and Z, and I mentioned that in my lectures. So I show where Luther didn't account for this and that, but I can see why he had objections with this and that council and didn't just take them at face value. I can see why he didn't just take this or that church father at face value. You oversimplify the situation whenever you just treat the Protestant reformers as if they're just idiots who just threw out the church fathers and councils and don't know anything about them. Again, they know more about the church fathers and the ecumenical councils than you likely will ever know about it. To be frank, that doesn't mean they're right. They're wrong, I will add. But they have accounted for things you're not even aware of, is all I'm saying. So just have a little bit more humility. Don't just take the deacon's approach of, this just came 500 years ago. They're rooting some of their criticisms in transubstantiation or whatever doctrine you want to, contest or address. They're rooting their views in some church fathers or at least their interpretation of them, and some councils and their interpretation of them, or they're dismissing some fathers and dismissing some councils because they're going to argue those councils and fathers are unreliable. And they have various reasons for why. I'm not saying their arguments are always right, but there are reasons that you haven't taken into account yet. So just have some humility. Let me point something out. Let me just bring you to reality if you haven't gotten the point already. Which sessions of Lateran 5 are authentic? Which sessions of Lateran 4 are authentic? Which sessions of Lateran 3 are authentic? Before we even get to the question of, are they exercising infallibility here? Is this doctrinal or is this disciplinary? Is this definitive? Is this non-definitive? Before we even get to that question in some of these councils, you have to ask the question, what constitutes part of this council? Which sessions of the Council of Basel are ecumenical? Do you know? Have you ever looked into it? Are the first 25 sessions ecumenical or not? You'll likely say sessions 26 and on are inauthentic and not ecumenical. But what about the first 25? Are they authentic? Are they ecumenical? Which sessions are ecumenical? Do you know? The Council of Basel, Ferrara, Florence, Rome, it's all one thing, right? It's all 4 different cities, sessions from 4 different cities over the period of 15 or so years. They all make up one ecumenical council. Okay. But within the first 25 sessions, you got them denying papal supremacy all over the place. All over the place. Based on Haec Sancta and Frequens, or at least their interpretation of Haec Sancta and Frequens from the Council of Constance, another ecumenical council. So which sessions are authentic? Do you know? The ones that are denying papal supremacy? The ones that are saying that they can sit in judgment of the Pope? Are you going to say those are ecumenical? Well, you would likely say no in light of Vatican I. Okay, so which sessions of Basel are authentic? Because pretty much all those sessions are denying papal primacy. So when you say that this is part of the ecumenical council, like which sessions? So are you going to say part of the session? Not the part where they teach heresy, but the other part where they don't teach heresy. So a critic and an educated Protestant or your Martin Luthers, they know this already. They already know what Constance said, and they know Haec Sancta, and they know Frequens, and they know Basil, and they know Pisa, which was not ecumenical, but it was considered ecumenical at the time, and it did deny papal supremacy. They're aware of these difficulties. And so it led them to say councils have contradicted each other. So Luther says at the Diet of Worms, these councils have contradicted each other. And a lot of Catholics want to just dismiss that. Well, I'm not saying Luther's right, but what I'm saying is you need to take into account what he's addressing. And what he's addressing is some serious difficulties between some sessions of Constance, some sessions of Basil, and later councils, and various sessions of Florence. Now, you very well might be able to harmonize it, but you're going to have a very detailed and nuanced answer before you can just dismiss Martin Luther. What I'm saying is this is just one example of many. You can't just pretend that these guys are a bunch of idiots. They don't know what they're talking about, and they just throw out church fathers and throw out the councils. That's not the way it worked. There's a grain of truth to it, but that's it. It's just a grain of truth. There's a whole lot more to it than that. That doesn't mean they're right, but it means it's more complex than you realize. And any critic who's educated will just simply point this out, and they will hold your feet to the fire. Right now, I could just play the atheist, hold your feet to the fire, and have you questioning every ecumenical council you ever held to. Now, I'm not going to do that, but the point is, if I can do that, I know others can. So you need to be prepared for that. You need to have answers for this. So, okay. So they talk about ecumenical councils. They talk about authority. The deacon wants to appeal to ecumenical councils. Of course, that raises the question, which ecumenical councils, right? So the deacon is not going to hold to Chalcedon and everything else after that. that either Catholics or Eastern Orthodox would hold to. He's going to hold to Nicaea, Constantinople 2. I'm sorry, Constantinople 1, and Ephesus 1. He might hold to Ephesus 2 as well, which Catholics and Eastern Orthodox don't. They say it's the robber synod, but he might hold to Ephesus 2 as well, 449. And at that point, we have a difficulty because as soon as he affirms Ephesus 1, the Catholic just has to point out, excuse me, Ephesus 1 affirmed papal primacy, and that it will be something that is perpetual in nature, that the role of the papacy in Rome is perpetual and won't defect from the faith. I wrote about that in my book, Answering Orthodoxy. I've done a lot of videos on it. Other people have noted it as well. It's very clear. Look at what Philip the Legate says at the council, and none of the council fathers contested. So there's an implicit affirmation of the dogma of papal supremacy right there at Ephesus 1, which is going to be adhered to by Oriental Orthodox, at least the council. They don't adhere to the doctrine, but okay, you're going to have to grapple with that. And you're going to have to address and account for the fact that you got a papal legate affirming or asserting papal supremacy, and the council fathers don't dispute it. And we're not talking about a primacy of a first among equals. We're not talking about that. That's not what Philip the Legate is saying there, if you're going to read him. So I think it's a little bit more difficult for the Oriental Orthodox than some of them may have you believe. But yeah, okay, which ecumenical councils, right? And why do you hold to the first three anyway? Why do you hold to these empire councils to begin with? Is it just because you believe that they have spoken the truth? Okay, so what standard do you use to determine that they've spoken the truth? You can't say apostolic succession because plenty of heretics had apostolic succession. You can't say scripture because plenty of heretics will assert their heresy based on scripture. Proverbs 8, for example, Arius will assert the creation of the Son of God based on Proverbs 8. So you can't just appeal to some of the stereotypical talking points that people will just throw out and that the deacon is throwing out. That's not going to be good enough if you have somebody who puts your feet to the fire and knows what they're talking about. So this is what I'm saying. Like it sounds nice at first, like the deacon sounds like he knows what he's talking about, and he certainly knows more than Stuart and Cliffe. But really, when you start to dig deeper, most of these people online, Catholics, Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, most of them, what they're putting out online, it's not sufficient for anyone who's educated in the area and will point out some of these greater difficulties. All right. I thought it was a little comical that Stuart brought up Vatican I, Vatican II, and Vatican III. Here's another low IQ guy. Are you disputing the ecumenical councils? If so, there's no point in arguing. No, Pippi, I'm not. You're another one of the people that I've said you're one of the reasons why I don't want to do live streams anymore, because you people tune in and y'all are like people who open up a book to the middle of the book and just start reading it. Like, do you ever do that? Probably not. You probably start from the beginning, right? Do that with live streams. Don't come into a live stream, mid-live stream or toward the end of the live stream and ask me stupid questions. Watch it from the beginning. I'm going to put here the scrolling marquee. Shut up and watch it from the beginning. Oh, I'm so tired of it. I'm over it. This is what I deal with 24/7. The majority of my critics, they don't actually listen to what I say. They do this kind of stupidity. They just take something out of context and run with it every single time. Back to what I was saying. He said Vatican I, Vatican II, Vatican III. First, before we get to the Vatican III thing, all right, before we get there, the reason why he brought it up is he was saying, well, you're the one who's bringing up the church fathers. And so I brought up Vatican I, Vatican II, Vatican III. And he's like, well, I don't hold to that. And there is no Vatican III. And, hold on. He says, Great Wall says, stay charitable. Don't let the critics win. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it, Great Wall. Stop it. Stop it. When you've gone through what I've gone through and put up with the stuff I've put up through, then I'll take that advice. Stop it. Stop. Now, back to what I was saying. He's like, I don't hold the Vatican I, Vatican II. They're all heretical. Well, upon what basis do you determine that they're heretical, right? And he rightly pointed out there is no Vatican III. I don't know where Stuart got a Vatican III from, but he got it from somewhere. It's certainly not from reality. Be that as it may, he brings up Vatican I, Vatican II, Vatican III because he thinks it's relevant to the Church Fathers. He's like, you can't hold to the Church Fathers without holding to Vatican I, Vatican II, Vatican III. Does he not know what time period Vatican I and Vatican II are from? So Vatican I, 1869 to 1870. Vatican II, 1962 to 1965. Yeah, I mean, these are the most recent ecumenical councils. There is no Vatican III. It would be an absolute nightmare if there were a Vatican III right now. And I've spoken about why the next ecumenical council will likely be the biggest disaster in church history. Hint, hint, because of the way fake news works. Which we saw some of that even at the time of the Council of Vatican II and the way the media was spinning it. That's what gave rise to the spirit of Vatican II, in part, by the way. Be that as it may. He's like, you can't take one and not the other. It's like he's not aware. There's a little bit of a time gap here between the patristic period and Vatican I. Depending on who you ask, the patristic period, depending on whether it's East or West, I mean, roughly in 6th, 8th century, again, depending on who you ask, versus 19th century, there's a pretty big gap there. So might want to do some basic studying in church history before you go out and start debating people. That's what I'm saying. Stuart, Cliffe, the whole shtick that they have, that works for an uneducated atheist, maybe. This is not going to work for. I'm not even talking about like your well-educated Catholics and Orthodox, just the regular Catholics and Orthodox that you have on Twitter. They're going to know more than Stuart and Cliffe. They got to step it up. Crack open a history book, something. He says that councils have changed over time. Well, I talk a lot about this again in the lectures on the ecumenical councils with CPU. I am going to offer a course April 26th for those of y'all who want to join. I'll put a link to it in the show notes if you want to join. It will be a live lecture, 2 lectures on the question of tensions in the magisterium, magisterial difficulties, and we'll talk about some of this. He says councils have changed. Well, you got to get more specific than that, right? Many of the ecumenical councils have changed matters of discipline. So you'll have like one ecumenical council adhering to this discipline, another ecumenical council will completely reverse it. Or you'll have an ecumenical council reversing an apostolic discipline. So you do have changes in ecumenical councils, but you have to ask what kind. If you're talking about doctrinal changes, that's a little bit more complicated. Even then, you have to ask the question, okay, is this a change in matters that are doctrinal, definitive doctrine or non-definitive doctrine? Some argue that Vatican II had some non-definitive doctrines that reversed some non-definitive preconciliar teachings. And it's not just Vatican II. You can also look at quite a few other ecumenical councils and some of its non-definitive teachings, and some would suggest they reversed other non-definitive teachings. And there's a lot of debate there. Obviously, from the Catholic perspective, the argument is going to be there's no reversals in definitive doctrine. But there will be a difficulty in demonstrating that against a knowledgeable critic. And so perhaps we'll discuss that in some of the in these online lectures that I'm going to do on the 26th. Again, if y'all want to sign up, go to rtcourses.com. If you want to sign up for that, I'm going to talk about it there. rtcourses.com, and click on Magisterial Difficulties, Exploring Tensions in the Magisterium, and sign up for it. You should be able to see it here. rtcourses.com, Magisterial Difficulties, Exploring Tensions in the Documents of the Church. Sign up for that, and we'll talk about it there. And I'll go over some of the difficulties and possible ways to harmonize them. But it will introduce you to the question of where there are some tensions and matters of doctrine that you need to be aware of. Just like you need to be aware of instances where there's tensions between one Bible verse versus another. Jesus says, I don't know the day or the hour of my coming, but then he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then he says, I am that I am. Well, he doesn't exactly say that. He says, before Abraham was, I am, hearkening back to the divine name, I am that I am. Wait, how is it that you're ignorant and yet you claim to be divine? So there's some tension there. You have to be able to reconcile it. There's various options that have been offered historically. That's maybe what we're going to talk about in this lecture. Is some of the tensions and possible ways to harmonize them. But you have to be aware, you might be inclined to just quickly dismiss Stuart, because I bet if you were to ask Stuart, okay, show me what these changes are with the councils, he probably couldn't give you an educated answer. But that doesn't mean that somebody else couldn't give you an educated answer. There are some tensions with Haec Sancta in Vatican I on Pastor Eternus, right? So Haec Sancta from Constance, some are going to say, no, that's not even authentic. Others are going to say it is authentic, and look at quite a few ecumenical councils that saw it as authentic. And how do you understand it saying that an ecumenical council is greater than a pope and stands in authority over him, whenever Vatican I says the exact opposite and elevates that to dogma? So those are kinds of tensions you'll need to be aware of. We got another one here. Eastern Orthodox dominate Protestants or Roman Catholics alike. Some do, but not your more educated ones. He says, debate Jay Dyer. Oh, another cult follower. Yeah, well, Jay, of course, declined his debate with me. So, yeah, anyways, all I'll just say to you cult followers is respond to my book, Answering Orthodoxy. Until you do that, I don't have anything else to say to you. All right, back to Stuart. Oh, let me grab this. Wouldn't you want to harmonize the apparent differences between councils if you're Catholic? Yeah, I do believe that it's necessary for all Catholics to harmonize them. I think the problem, however, is many Catholics don't. And so you'll find a weird situation where many of the online Catholics and content creators and the big names are actually the very ones saying that the magisterium is contradicting itself. And I've spent a considerable amount of time interacting and refuting their positions on this channel. But yeah, oddly enough, you would think that Catholics would want to do that, right? But many Catholics are Protestants at heart. They hold to a view of the magisterium just like Luther did. They don't realize it, but they fight against the magisterium just like Luther did. And ironically, for some of the same reasons, and they don't realize it. And they will argue that the magisterium contradicts itself, and they won't use a hermeneutic of continuity, and they won't attempt to harmonize. They'll use a hermeneutic of rupture and discontinuity, which is a page right out of the playbook from the liberals, because it was the liberals who started that with their dissent against Humanae Vitae, especially. Be that as it may. Back to what we're saying. Okay. The deacon said Vatican I, Vatican II are heretical. I just have to ask, by what standard do you determine that? Pretty much any answer he gives, I think it could be demonstrated that he's going to be inconsistent. He again asserts confidently that nobody denied the real presence in the 1st to 3rd century. That's just factually not true. We know from the writings of the Apostolic Fathers that some people did. They're again called the Gnostics. Yes, you're going to say, well, the Gnostics are wrong. Fine. But they're people who denied the real presence, right? Right. Okay, so you can't say nobody denied it. Can't say that we don't know that anyone denied it. Yes, we do. He then appeals to the ante-Nicene fathers, and he starts to name a whole bunch of them: Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Athenagoras, and I forget who all he said, but a whole bunch of them. And 2 points. Number one, it's not as easy as just appealing to them, because again, a critic is just going to say, first of all, not all these guys agreed on the doctrine of the Trinity, which, yeah, it's admittedly true. As John Henry Newman will point out in his work, and many others will point out, and it's hardly controversial for anyone who has actually read the primary sources. Yeah, sure, they weren't always articulating the Trinity in a way that the Nicene Fathers did, and in some cases, some of them were subordinationists. And so you wouldn't hold to subordinationism, and you certainly wouldn't adhere to some of the views of Justin Martyr, for example, on the Trinity. So you can't just throw out those names as if they're an ultimate standard of truth, because a critic is just going to say, but wait, you don't agree with them on X, Y, and Z, and they don't agree on X, Y, and Z, and they don't agree on even the Trinity or Christology. And so it's not as simple as just simply appealing to them. You have to give a greater argument for why the church fathers are witnesses to the deposit of faith, and how to identify when they are versus how to identify when they're just given a private opinion. You're going to have those discussions. And of course, not all of those people had the same view on the real presence, because not all of those people even spoke about the real presence. So we don't even know what some of their views were on the question of the Eucharist, because some of the people he named don't even write about the question of the real presence, but he's throwing it out like they're all just clear cut. It's not always the case. Now, that's not to say that he's wrong about the question of the real presence, but it's to say that you gotta give more than just throwing it out there. All right. And then lastly, Cliffe steps in and he's like, this has gone on too long because it's embarrassing for him and his son. So he's like, ultimately, what's the ultimate authority here? And of course, we get the anti-papist view from the deacon. He's like, there is no authority beyond the local bishop, which is pretty much the same view of ecclesiology as the Eastern Orthodox. So it fails for the same reason as Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology fails. And also it's inconsistent with the ecclesiology of Ephesus 1, which the deacon would profess to hold to, that adheres to papal ecclesiology. Again, Philip the legate. Not just a first among equals kind of thing, not just a situation where every bishop is a Peter kind of thing. So I think that that's where he would be really weak, but Stuart and Cliffe don't know enough about ecclesiology to really have that discussion and show the deacon where he likely won't have sufficient answers or consistent answers. And I think that's where the the Eastern Orthodox and especially Catholics could point out some flaws in his views. More so the Catholic position. Okay. He ultimately says it's Jesus and the church. Well, everybody says that. Protestants say that too, right? Protestants say that Jesus and the church is like a standard of truth, right? Is the authority. Plenty of Protestants will say that. Eastern Orthodox say that. Catholics say that. Everybody says that. Okay. Which church? What church? How do we identify? You can't just say the bishop, the priest, the deacon. Which one? You got a whole bunch of schismatic bishops, heretical bishops in the early church, present today. Which bishop, which deacon, which priest? And so you can't just appeal to that threefold hierarchy structure on a local level, because you got your Oriental Orthodox here, you got your Eastern Orthodox in the same town, you got your Catholics in the same town, you got Anglicans who would claim apostolic succession in the same town. Which one? So you're going to have to give more than that appeal to a local ecclesiology or a local bishop as the standard of the church. Which church? How do you identify? So I don't think that he gave a sufficient answer there. But at that point, they just cut their losses, ended the conversation. They were done. They didn't want to have anything more to do with that. I thought that was pretty comical. But it's not the slam dunk that a lot of people think it is for Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, or Oriental Orthodox, who often use many of the arguments that the deacon used. It's not the slam dunk you think, because of what I just pointed out today and many other things. I just went over 2 hours of material. Believe me, I could sit here and talk for 10 hours and give you a whole lot more. But hopefully this is giving you some food for thought. It's making you think of these things from an angle that you haven't thought of. It's therefore steel manning your critics and will make you aware of their objections so that you can start to think through these things sufficiently and start to come up with responses to account for their objections. Because if I don't point them out to you, they will point them out to you, and they'll likely embarrass you in the process. So rather than you go through that, it's best that you hear it now and you're prepared to start working through those. And, I talk about a lot of these issues on the channel all the time, and I've offered some potential solutions to a lot of what we discussed today. So plenty of extra content where you could go through material and work through various issues. Just do a keyword search right here on the channel. And of course, also you can take any of my courses at rtcourses.com. Or you could take my courses on the Magisterium with Catholic Polytechnic University and the Magisterial Study Certificate program that's going to be starting back up here in May. So if you want to get that Magisterial Study Certificate program and you want to go over a lot of the material that we went through by going into how the Magisterium works, all 21 ecumenical councils, and then how to properly evaluate magisterial documents and going through many, many instances and going through magisterial difficulties and how to properly evaluate them and harmonize them and all that. If you want to go through that with a formal program, you need to get my courses with Catholic Polytechnic University, and you need to do it now while you still get the early bird discount. What you'll do if you're interested in that, go to catholicpolytechnic.org/magisterium. So catholicpolytechnic.org/magisterium. And you'll come here and you'll sign up. Click here to register. Once you register, also go and pay the tuition. Right now you got the early bird discount, and that will get you going for the first of 3 of the courses for the entire program. So certainly check it out there if you want to know more. There's only so much I can do in a live stream. A lot of this stuff, that program covers 30 courses. 30 lessons in 3 courses, and they're usually an hour to an hour and a half each. And so it's a lot of material. It's not something that I can address in just one live stream. So if you want to hear solutions to stuff, if you want to hear a deeper dive with some of the stuff that you heard today, you'll certainly want to check that out. Or check out the first 7 ecumenical councils courses that I did at rtcourses.com, where we discuss some of this. All right, that's going to do it. Everybody hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and of course, check me out at patreon.com/Reason to Theology if you want to financially support the channel so I can continue to offer content like this show available to you all for free. Y'all just got 2 hours of this material for free. You can't beat that, but I need your support. Go to patreon.com/Reason to Theology. Join at any level of participation there, or click the join button right next to the subscribe button right here on YouTube and support the channel there. See you tomorrow. God bless. Has someone ever come to you and spoken about contradictions in the Catholic Church's magisterium? I'm really excited to tell you that I'm going to be exploring magisterial difficulties and various ways in which people have attempted to harmonize tensions that can be found in the magisterium, in the teachings of the Catholic Church. We're going to explore these tensions in quite a few areas: slavery, the death penalty, religious liberty, and many other topics. I'm going to do this in 2 lectures that you can attend with me live on video, and you can ask me questions questions at the end. There will be 2 lectures, 50 minutes each with a 15-minute break in between, and 30 minutes for Q&A at the end where you can ask me any question about the topic that you would like. If you would like to attend, it's going to be on April 26th at 12 p.m. Central, and you can join me live via video. You'll also be able to come back and watch the video at a later time because it will be posted as a course. So if you miss it live, you can still see the video later on. I hope you get a chance to check it out. Magisterial Difficulties, Exploring the Tensions and the Documents of the Church. And right now there's an early bird discount going on, so be sure to check it out. I got a link to it in the show description, or visit rtcourses.com for more information. I hope to see you there. Are you seeking clarity in the midst of confusion about Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism? In my book, Answering Orthodoxy, I offer a biblical and historical response to the most common objections that Eastern Orthodox offer against the Catholic Church. This book is for anyone searching for the truth, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, or simply trying to make sense of the differences between Catholics and Orthodox. Order your copy today and discover the rational, biblical, and historical basis for the Catholic Church. Visit Amazon to order your copy today.